Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I am coming to you from Philadelphia, and I'm thrilled to be able to help to kick off this event and talk about these really important issues with my fellow educators as we face an extraordinary moment and try to think about going back to teaching with students who are going through a lot. I'm just going to start my slides here. I'm going to be looking forward today to speaking with you about students and what they're going through in this moment during the pandemic. I'm going to be using some new data and sharing with you some suggestions for the things that you can be doing to try to support students. But first, I really do want to think about this moment with you. And here we have some headlines from things that happened in the spring. There were a tremendous number of different reactions that higher education had as it had to close. But one of the things that I think was so common across the country was that in the desperation to close quickly and to try to do the right thing, in many cases, our practices were really not very inclusive. And in many cases, we didn't take care of the people who were really the most at risk. And that includes many of our adjunct faculty whose needs were not attended to. And it also includes many of our students who, while they might be on scholarship, for example, still really don't have their living expenses met. And so as we think about what this moment means, we need to kind of remember what the moment really looked like even just a few months ago. Now, as a backdrop to understanding where we are now and where we're going to be as we enter this fall, I want to talk a little bit about the new economics of college. This is a topic that I've been talking about for a number of years, and it's described in detail in my book, Paying the Price. I try to talk about it as a comprehensive set of factors that are creating challenges for both faculty and for students and administrators right now. And importantly, these things go well beyond tuition, even though, let's be honest, tuition is what everybody tends to talk about. Here on the screen, you can see my contrasts. If we just pick one of the new economics of college, the burden of price, the contrast between where things were, let's say in the 70s and 80s, the time that we tend to think of as the good old days, where we were in this century before the pandemic and where we can expect to be now thanks to the pandemic. And as you can see, of course, the burden of price is going to be falling more and more heavily onto students. And this is a political choice. This is state governments and federal shifting the burden onto students and their families. Another really important thing then that's happening against that backdrop is the changes to the family's economics. And this affects those of us who work in higher education as well as the students, of course. In the past, you're supposed to be able to think of the likelihood that as the living costs go up from year to year, your salary will too, or you might get a bonus even, something we hardly ever see now. When tuition was rising, when living costs were rising in the 80s, we didn't hear much outcry about the cost. And that was partly because people were, not all people, but many people were getting ahead year after year. And that really stopped in the last couple of decades. And we saw this really rising level of wealth inequality that, let's be honest, is also racially disparate wealth inequality. Now we're seeing people lose their jobs, people are losing income, and inequality continues to grow. Another really important aspect of the new economics has to do with working through college. Now, I am fairly confident that if I could see your hands raised, if I asked you if you were a student who worked your way through college, that the vast majority of you would say that you were employed in college. It's not a new thing. But I also want you to think about the kind of job that you had. And I bet many of you worked in industries like the restaurant industry. Now, if you were in school, you might drive for Uber. The kinds of industries that frankly have been very hard hit by the pandemic. There were already declining opportunities for college students to work while in school. We were already dealing with the fact that the minimum wage, the value of the minimum wage had been declining for years. But now that problem is even worse. To make matters more challenging, the social safety net has always in the past been part of how people pay for college if they have low incomes. But again, that has changed. So in the 1970s, if you did not have enough money for food, it was not all that hard if you were income qualified to go and get food stamps. But if you were a student in 2010 or in 2018 and you were food insecure, not only would you face an income test, but unless you had children, you would also face a work requirement. And unfortunately, the work requirement does not count college as work. And so that means that this pushes students to do more work while in school just in order to be able to access the social safety net. During the pandemic, we've actually seen things get a bit worse. We've seen some incredible decisions from Congress where they supported people with stimulus checks, but decided that a large fraction of college students should not receive those checks, seemingly based on the assumption that just because a student was a dependent on their family for tax purposes, that assumes that they're actually getting money from their families. Something that we know is not true for large numbers of students, including members of the LGBTQ community who are estranged from their families and aren't receiving any support at all. Another really big challenge closely related to all of this is government funding support for the institutions themselves. Now, I know as faculty, we're feeling this very acutely. While the public wants to talk about institutions as being cash cows and assumes that they mostly have very large endowments, for the most part, the truth is institutions don't have an endowment or much of one, and the per student funding for supporting students and teaching them has been going down. And unfortunately, I think it's pretty clear we're seeing a real acceleration of that during the pandemic. And we're going to be told it's because we have to make hard choices. This again, I think is a political decision. I don't think it's an evidence-based decision because the evidence shows that the return on investment to education is extremely high, not only for individuals, but actually more importantly for whole communities and for state budgets. And finally, the other new economics of college that we've got to grapple with is our health and well-being. And this is true not only for the students, but also for their educators. Now, both physical and mental health are conditions of learning. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, or if you have COVID, you're going to have a hard time being able to concentrate on school, and we know that. And the truth is that the physical and mental health of people both working in and learning in higher education was already on the decline before the pandemic. And now here we are. Okay, so I do apologize. I know it's deeply depressing, but I hope that that gives you a broader picture of why the work is so important at this moment and about the number of different things that would have to be addressed, root cause issues, in order for us to actually become, in a better place and get on the road to recovery. So what's very, very clear from research, both in K-12 education and in higher education, is that what happens outside the classroom matters for what happens in it. Now, we do some really unfortunate things in higher ed in that we use language like non-academic issues when we refer to rent, but there aren't too many students who are going to be able to learn in the classroom or do their homework if they can't pay their rent. It would be very strange, frankly, for a teacher in kindergarten to suggest that whether or not the student got the free lunch that day was a non-academic issue. They really wouldn't bother trying to distinguish the two in that way. They might distinguish between curricular issues and perhaps non-curricular, but they wouldn't try to use language that dismissed these other really important things as just actually not central to academics. And the fact is that we also try to talk about college students as having living expenses that everyone else has. Well, it's actually harder to meet those living expenses when you're in college for the reasons that I described earlier, including the time constraints, the exclusions from the social safety net that are supposed to help you pay for things, and the fact that many colleges and universities have had to turn to food and housing as auxiliary enterprises to make up for revenue that's been lost due to defunding from state governments and or lost from tuition. And we're learning this the hard way right now, as institutions are struggling with decisions like about giving housing refunds if the campus closes. It's not that they don't wish they could, and it's not that they don't see the reason, but they're trying to figure out how to make their budgets work if they give up on that revenue. So what does all this look like? Well, as we approach the fall, let's take a moment and look back at the spring. My team had just released our big annual Real College survey at the end of February and early March when the pandemic hit. And I'm so grateful to the full team at the Hope Center for recognizing that even though they were exhausted and glad to be done with that survey report, that they actually needed to get back to work and pivot to doing yet another survey. So we went out into the field and we asked colleges and universities around the country if they would let us survey their students. And you can see that 39 two-year colleges and 15 universities said yes, which is wonderful, and we're so grateful to them. They're from 26 states around the country, and you know how crazy things were, and they were working to close and to help students pivot online, and yet they said yes. And further, when they sent the survey out to their students, some students also said yes, they would do the survey. Now, I want to be very clear. This is an electronic survey. It does not guarantee anybody any money to take the survey. It does not give them any kind of help. In other words, it's something that somebody who's busy or stressed out, particularly during a pandemic, would actually tend to say no to and not participate in. So we are not surprised that our response rate to this survey is less than 10%. It is typical for electronic surveys to be low response rates. And during a pandemic, in many cases, that's what we're seeing too. But let's think for a moment about who would do such a survey and who wouldn't. We would tend to think, based on all of our work, that the students in the most trouble, the students who can't even access their email because they don't have internet, students whose computers are having trouble, students who aren't sure where they're living and therefore are not even opening their computers to do work. They're struggling with their housing situation. These are the people who would disproportionately not even get the email, let alone open it and say yes. 38,602 amazing students around the country, though, opened the email and said yes. And so let me just show you the situation they found themselves in at that time between weeks 4 through 8 of the pandemic. Basic needs insecurity refers to food and or housing insecurity and or homelessness. We measure all three. We do so with scientific validated measures that we have been using for years. And as you can see here, on the day that they took that survey, 58% of those more than 38,000 people were affected by at least one of those issues. Now, the food insecurity had been occurring over the last 30 days for those folks. The housing insecurity was occurring on that day. 41% of four-year university students were dealing with housing insecurity on that very day, and 15% of them were in fact homeless on that very day. That's really unfortunate, and it's notable that while typically community college students experience these issues at higher rates than 4 years, you can see that during the pandemic, four-year students were actually even more affected, but both had very high rates. Remarkably, one of our key points was of those 38,000 students, 6% said the day they took the survey, they were not safe where they were living. I want you to think about that student who will be on your classroom, but it doesn't have their camera turned on, for example, when they're listening to you this fall. What are they going through? To say they are not safe where they are living suggests need for support. And I'll show you in a moment, very, very few were receiving it. But this amounts to about 2,000 individuals or more. Now, there was a lot of attention, and there is a lot of attention paid to students who live on campus. And I understand that, in our imagination of who college students are, that's who we think of. Please remember, though, that even before the pandemic, only 15% of American undergraduates resided on a college campus, and it's less than half of those at four-year institutions. We do see that students who were living on campus were affected by housing insecurity during the pandemic. In many cases, colleges and universities focused their support on those students, thinking the main problem was they had to give up their on-campus housing and go on, or leave to go home. But it was actually the students living off campus who were more affected. And it makes sense. These folks lost jobs. These folks were struggling to pay rent, and the landlords were still insisting on it until the eviction moratorium was put into place. But now we're at a moment where the eviction moratoriums are being lifted. I believe that issues like cancel rent and decisions made about eviction moratoriums are in fact critical issues that are going to drive whether or not some of these students show up for school this fall and how they do during this term. I next want to draw some attention to racial disparities, which have been pronounced in our data for a long time and deserve so much more attention. These are the data from last fall 2019. This is the rate of any basic needs insecurity as measured for both African Americans or Black students, that is their self-identification, and as measured for white students. As you can see, there was a 16 percentage point disparity as measured before the pandemic. During the pandemic, that disparity widened. Interestingly, it's not so much that things worsened for African Americans, it's hard to imagine it getting much worse. As you can see, almost 3 in 4 African American students were affected. But they got a little better for white students. And that causes us to wonder, for example, about who the supports that institutions offer and that government offers, who they're actually reaching and who they benefit. Now, as we think about the implications of this disparity, of course, we have to remember that the pandemic has also had racially disparate impacts. But I also want you to consider the other racial disparity that higher education has been dealing with for a very long time. And that's the racial disparity in college completion rates, which mirrors the racial disparity in basic needs insecurity. Go back and forth for a moment so you can see that. They're virtually the same size, and the rates, as you can see, are just essentially swapped. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of students lost jobs. Hey, a lot of faculty and staff did as well. But it's important to note that 70+% of these 38,000 students were working before the pandemic. It is very common to work. And what we saw happen to them was about a third, a little more than a third, actually lost their job entirely by weeks 4 through 8 of the pandemic. And many others had reduced hours or pay. One of the things that means is that they've been financially unstable for months now. And as they go back to school this fall, many of them will be going back without the savings that they tend to try to put together during summer months. You will undoubtedly have students overwhelmingly who will say, I cannot afford books. They usually use their summer savings to pay for books, for example. So this is a really important thing to remember. It may be that it seems like they have more time available now because they're not working. But remember, many of them are going to be searching for work that they cannot find. I also want to note that African American students are disproportionately working as frontline workers during this pandemic. And so while they might not be unemployed, they might have money coming in, they are also at greater risk of having a health consequence from the job in which they're working. We checked in on students in a variety of ways. We are hardly the only ones at the Hope Center to report that students are experiencing a great deal of anxiety. That anxiety is felt regardless of institution type. It should not be surprising to anyone that students reported they could not concentrate on their schooling. And this was even higher for students at 4-year colleges versus at 2-year colleges. We suspect that partly that's about the living situation changing somewhat more rapidly for the students at the 4-year colleges. Students at 2-year colleges, for the most part, were staying in place in terms of where they were living, but they were experiencing economic shifts. And this is really important. We asked students about their responsibility for taking care of family members. Please remember that 1 in 4 college students, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5, actually has a child. And in addition, we have lots of college students who are taking care of younger brothers and sisters, of cousins, of parents, etc. And that represents a real challenge, especially when those people are residing with them during this time. And you can see this is affecting large numbers of individuals. Now, are these students getting the help that they need? No, at the time between weeks 4 through 8 of the pandemic, they definitely were not. If you look at the bottom line on this slide, you'll see that only 21% had applied for unemployment, despite the fact that very large fractions of them should have been eligible. We see that only 15% applied for SNAP, despite the fact that about almost half of students were dealing with food insecurity. And only 15% had actually applied for emergency aid on their campus. despite the fact that that was the #1 thing that campuses said that they were doing to respond to this crisis. What's going on? Well, look, it seems that with regard to the public benefits, most students don't know the option is available to them, or they perceive themselves as ineligible. Now, you might say to yourself, well, they are ineligible for some of those things. I want you to shift the mindset. That's the way the laws are written, and they're written in that way to lead you to think the students are not eligible because they are sort of actively discouraging people from using public benefits. The government's approach to this has been, it's not on us to help you access our programs. If you access our programs and you know how to navigate for them, then and only then will we support you. So we need to shift our mindset to thinking that our students may very well be eligible and get them help to sort out if they are. There are also a lot of students who didn't even know the program existed, and that is especially true with regard to emergency aid. So I'm going to talk in a moment about things that faculty can do in this regard, because one of the most important things we have to do is just do the outreach. Your campuses, almost all of them, have an emergency aid program at this point, in large part because of the Federal CARES Act. Whether or not the funds are available at the moment, students should be applying for them, because that gives the administration information on the demand, provides useful information for fundraising, and helps them know that even if they can't give that student the money, perhaps they can direct another form of support to them, maybe even just someone, a peer, who could listen to them. That brings me to the theme, I think, of what we call real college in this country, but also what it means to go to college during the pandemic. And the Wu-Tang puts it better than anyone else. Cash rules everything around me. Now, I don't say this to you to try to trivialize it. I say this to you because I'm hoping that this song, and I urge you, pull it up on your Spotify playlist. Maybe the DJ could play it tonight during the party. I want you to keep this as your mantra as you think about the student that you're trying to reach this year. When cash rules everything around you, you have a scarcity mindset. The science on scarcity says that leads you to have more difficulty in trying to engage with complex topics. It creates difficulty. You have less bandwidth to think about the long term. And it leads to behaviors that many of us will then refer to as quote unquote irrational. And that's a problem. I think it seems, oh goodness, it seems that my slides are not showing, and I just got a note about that, and I am so sorry. So I'm just gonna go back to the data for real quick. I went over this. Here's the housing insecurity by on or off campus. Okay, so you can clearly see the higher rates of housing insecurity for students who were off campus. Here you can see the gap. This is one I really wanted you to be able to visualize. Here's the black-white gap last fall. Here's the black-white gap during the pandemic. And here's the black-white gap in degree completion rates. Go back and forth during the pandemic and in completion rates. Okay, here are the rates of job insecurity. Okay, and let's see. Here are the rates of anxiety, concentration, taking care of family members. And here are the statistics on help seeking that I was just going over with you. So please just look at the bottom line. You can see very few students actually even applying for the help that they need. Okay. All right, that brings me back to CREAM, and again, with my apologies. So look, if you center CREAM as you teach this fall, as you work with students this fall, it will just serve to remind you to take a pause and think about the humanity of the person that you're trying to interact with. Students are humans first, just like we, frankly, as educators, are humans first. And that's the main message I want you to get there. Okay, so how can we help students? Let me go over a couple of options here. As I said, students are humans first. One of the most important things you can do to recognize that is with regard to your language and your tone. Now, I know, for example, at Temple University, we receive some specific directions that we provide students to remind them about how tone matters online. So one, obvious and important thing to do is to try to avoid all caps at any time when communicating with someone. But also to try to be sure that you're not rushing too much as you're communicating with students in chats, that you take a pause. Remember that people who are going through a lot, they will not process quite as quickly. Also, insert some language that, as you speak to students, conveys your own humanity. Let them know that you too are feeling the challenges. Try not to suggest that what's happening outside the classroom doesn't matter for what's happening inside the classroom. I know it may not be salient to your subject matter, but it doesn't really matter. It's salient to everything right now. And to the extent that you can, acknowledge their stress and acknowledge their basic needs. If you're worried about rent, maybe say something, not to complain, but again, to say maybe others of you are as well. And I know that's going on for folks. And, maybe point them to some resources that your campus might have, at least starting with emergency aid. There's a new study out from my colleagues at UC Davis that is fascinating called My Professor Cares. The Hope Center is going to be putting out an accessible look at what that study taught us soon. In the meantime, I want you to know that this study found that strategic emails sent by faculty to students actually really do boost student achievement. You should do personalized emails. So unfortunately, this is a little bit of work, but what you want to do is send the students notes periodically during the term. Do something to affirm that they are making progress in the class if they are making progress in the class. They do need a reminder that they are getting somewhere. Give them a couple of tips on how to succeed. Make the implicit explicit, because trying to guess at ways to succeed, especially when you're super stressed, it's hard. And your grades are not trying to measure whether in fact they can guess at these things. Your grades are trying to measure how they do with their content. And share supports that are relevant to their lives. Maybe you want to open a Google Doc where you're going to update your students with supports as you go through the term, as you hear about them, so that you don't have to send them a lot of emails, for example. I want to point you towards a couple of resources that are located online that can support students at any institution around the country. So as noted in my introduction, I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Equity, which is an emergency aid company and one of Course Heroes' partners in that regard. We are known for doing distribution of emergency aid, but in addition, our amazing team designed a gorgeous website that's at covidcollegesupport.com. Nothing is being sold to students at this website. It does not cost students anything to go to this website, but it does help them to learn about all kinds of supports. And what we did was that we hired students around the country who had been laid off from work to help to create these resources. So these are made by students for students. In addition, if you go to risefree.org/COVID-19 help, or just go to risefree.org and look for COVID on the page, you will find out that they have set up a student navigator network. Now, very early on, we worked also with RISE around another emergency aid fund. And one of the things that we found was, of course, there were just a lot of students who didn't know about resources. And providing them with one-on-one navigational support was really, really key. And I'm thrilled to say that RISE has built this support out such that students can now go to this website and they're going to receive navigational support offered by students paid for their work to fellow students. A couple of more things for you to think about. The first is I urge you to think flexible. And this is for both you and for your students. I've been working with Digital Pedagogy Lab for a couple of years now, and one of the things that someone there advised me as I'm setting up my course is to stop thinking about planning the entire semester right now in August. I can't tell you how happy I was to hear that I didn't have to do that, and in fact, it would be better if I didn't do that. The recommendation was to plan the first 4 to 6 weeks, and then let the students know that additional material would be coming, because we don't know where we're going to be in 4 to 6 weeks, and you might want to make adjustments. Focus on the assignments that really matter. Try not to give students busy work during this time. Try to focus on asynchronous content, over attendance, so to speak. Now, I know this is a little controversial, and for some of us, we haven't thought of ways to assess student performance without attendance. But synchronous content is going to be very, very hard for students to actually embrace. And asynchronous content will also be easier for you to deliver. And to the extent that you can, try to look for growth in their learning over the term rather than holding them to some kind of absolute standards, especially standards that were developed before the pandemic. When you're supporting these humans, there are a couple of tools and things that you can do that our colleagues around the country have tried and found work. Being basic needs insecure is profoundly isolating. People in this country who don't have a lot of money are taught to believe it's their fault. It is part of our ethos. It's in the water. Students who are struggling with money, economic insecurity, also believe they are alone. Please affirm for them that they are not alone. Use the data if you need to. Tell them, studies show that all of these other people out there are also affected. Tell them a story about another student you know without using their name. Tell them about you. Be human with your students, share your struggles. To the extent that you can, also try to normalize some of these things. Not to say it's acceptable that we're all going through these challenges, not to say it's okay that we're dealing with so much anxiety, but make it something that people can talk about, okay? Make it something that we can say to each other, you know, maybe it's important for you to take a break and be able to, you know, refresh before you come back to focusing on this material. And of course, do everything you can, and please form, you know, I don't know, pods, networks, collaborative groups, anything you can with your friends to try to manage your own anxiety during this time. I don't think I need to tell you that when you're anxious, when we're anxious as teachers, our students can feel it. And I'd be remiss if I did not urge you as well to advocate. It can be at the local level with your mayors, it can be at the state level, and it can also be at the federal level. We need to include students in stimulus payments and unemployment. We need to increase emergency aid funding. There are many proposals coming and have been offered to do just that. We need to make sure that those dollars go to the institutions with the least resources and the most students in need. That is not what happened with the CARES Act. A disproportionate number of resources flowed away from where there was financial need. We need to suspend the SNAP work requirements, and I thank all of you, including Course Hero, who joined the Hope Center in sending a letter to Congress this week, asking them to do just that in the upcoming stimulus bill. We need to support institutions to expand their support services and improve teacher working conditions. It is clearly time to take the lessons from K-12 and understand that teacher working conditions are student learning conditions. And last, I firmly believe that our efforts to make public higher education free are absolutely necessary and that the pandemic underlines those things. To be clear, that does not mean telling the students it's free and not giving the institutions resources or the faculty resources with which to teach. Making public higher education free is about broadening the political coalition that experiences and is invested in public higher education. It is a mechanism through lowering the price to bring back and restore support to public higher education. It must come with additional investments, and it must come for accountability such that institutions are held responsible for making investments in the things that students need, which starts with teachers with good working conditions. I'm so grateful to you all for being here with me today, and I thank you for your patience, and I apologize for the technological challenges. We can be reached anytime. There's our website, and again, I appreciate you.